Welcome back to the Shigeaki podcast, where aging meets wisdom, and where every episode is your invitation to live stronger, sleep deeper, and feel more in control of your body. I'm Dr. Mark Hyman, and today's topic is something deeply personal for millions of people over 60: frequent nighttime urination. Waking up 2, 3, even 4 times a night to go to the bathroom sound familiar. You're not alone. In fact, one of my patients, George, 74, came to me exhausted, not because of illness, not because of stress, but because he hadn't slept through the night in over a year. He said, "Doc, I can handle aging, but I can't handle feeling like a prisoner in my own bathroom." And what shocked him most, the solution wasn't a new pill. It wasn't surgery. It wasn't even cutting water. It was food. 3 simple vegetables added to his dinner routine changed everything. So here's today's hook. What if I told you that 3 vegetables, common, affordable, and delicious, could help you sleep through the night and give your bladder the rest it deserves? To dive into this, I'm joined by the man whose name this podcast proudly bears, Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, Japan's most beloved physician, neurologist, and longevity expert, who even after crossing the 100-year mark still teaches us how to live and rest with purpose.
Thank you, Dr. Hyman. And to all our listeners, I want to say this clearly. Waking up at night is not always about aging. Sometimes it is about how we eat, what we give our kidneys, what we ask of our bladder, and most importantly, how we prepare our body for rest. I have spent decades with patients who suffered for years thinking this is just part of getting older. But then they made a few small changes, mostly in their evening meals, and for the first time in years they slept.
So, in today's episode, we're going to reveal the top 3 vegetables that can help reduce nighttime urination naturally. We'll explain why they work, how to use them, and when to eat them. And as always, we'll blend science from the West with ancient practices from Japan. So you not only live longer, you sleep better. Let's begin. Let's clear something up right away. Waking up once in the night to use the bathroom, that can be normal, especially if you've had fluids late in the day. But 2, 3, 4 times a night, that's not just inconvenient, that's your body sending you a message. And here's what bothers me the most. Too many seniors are told that's just part of getting older, but it's not. Frequent nighttime urination, or nocturia, isn't caused by age alone. It's caused by what age exposes weaker kidneys, increased bladder sensitivity, hormonal shifts, and yes, poor hydration and food habits in the evening.
In Japan, we never assume that nighttime waking is natural for elders. We ask, what are they drinking after 5 p.m.? Are they consuming too much salt at dinner? Are they eating foods that inflame the bladder? And above all, is their body being asked to work too hard when it's supposed to be resting? The truth is, your kidneys and bladder are designed to rest at night. But if you overload them too much fluid, too much sodium, or the wrong kinds of vegetables, they keep working. And so, you keep waking.
Exactly. I had a patient who swore he stopped drinking anything after 6 p.m., but he was still up 4 times a night. When we looked closer, we found the problem wasn't his water. It was what he was eating with dinner canned soup, salty sauces, and high-acid vegetables like tomatoes and peppers. All of it was irritating his bladder and pulling more water into his system late in the day.
In Japan, we prepare the body for sleep beginning with dinner. We serve calming, moist vegetables, nothing spicy, nothing fermented late. And we tell our elders, eat to sleep, not to excite.
That's so powerful, because what you're describing isn't just food, it's timing, it's intention. It's about preparing the body for deep rest. So if you've been told that waking up every night is just normal, please hear us today. It's common, yes, but not normal. And most importantly, it's fixable.
And often it starts not with pills, but with plants. With the right vegetables, eaten the right way at the right time.
Coming up, we'll reveal the top 3 vegetables we recommend for seniors dealing with nighttime urination and exactly how to use them to reclaim your sleep. Let's give your bladder a break and give your nights back. Let's start with one of the most overlooked vegetables when it comes to urinary health: celery. Now, I know celery doesn't sound exciting. It's crunchy, it's watery, and most people think it belongs next to peanut butter or dip. But here's the magic. Celery is a natural diuretic, which means it helps your body release excess fluid gently during the day, so your kidneys and bladder aren't overloaded at night. It also contains a compound called apigenin, which has calming effects on the smooth muscle tissue of the bladder. That means fewer spasms, less urgency, and less waking. I tell my patients a few stalks of celery with lunch or in an afternoon smoothie can train your body to release water earlier in the day when it's meant to, not at 2 a.m. Even more importantly, celery is naturally hydrating and rich in potassium, a mineral that balances sodium, supports kidney function, and reduces fluid retention.
In Japan, we often serve celery, lightly steamed or chopped into miso soup. But here is what matters most. We do not eat it at night. We teach our elders to eat celery before 4 p.m. Why? Because we want the body to let go of extra water while the sun is still up, so the kidneys may rest when darkness comes. And let me share a small story. There was a woman in her 80s who complained to me about waking up 5 times every night. She was strong, independent, but exhausted. She said, "Doctor, I sleep with fear because I know the night will be interrupted." We didn't give her pills. We simply moved her celery to lunch, added a warm foot soak in the evening, and within 1 week, she slept through the night. Tears came to her eyes not because of the science, but because she felt like herself again. That is the power of the right food at the right time.
Second on the list is one I bet you already have in your kitchen: onion. Yes, humble everyday onion. What most people don't realize is that onions are rich in quercetin, a natural anti-inflammatory compound that helps calm the urinary tract and reduce irritation of the bladder lining. But there's more. Onions also support lower blood pressure, which in turn reduces fluid pressure inside your vascular system. Less pressure means less fluid leaking into the bladder overnight. I often recommend my older patients include roasted or sautéed onions with dinner about 3-4 hours before bedtime. The warmth of the cooked onion soothes digestion, and its natural oils help ease tension in the abdomen. Plus, it's comforting. Onion has a grounding quality. It makes the body feel like it's winding down, not speeding up.
We have an old saying in Japan: a roasted onion is the pillow for the bladder. For many years in my practice, we would serve elderly patients a simple evening meal: rice porridge, roasted onion slices with sesame oil, and a cup of warm barley tea. You might think, how can this be medicine? But the result was always the same. The body quieted, the face relaxed, and the sleep deepened. You see, onion does not only help the bladder, it helps the nervous system. It slows the heartbeat. It cools the internal fire. And for elders who are often anxious at night, this makes a very big difference. Let me tell you, I've seen patients go from 5 bathroom trips per night to 1 just by adding roasted onion to dinner and removing salty sauces. We often look for complex answers, but sometimes the solution is a warm plate and a quiet room.
Now, this may surprise some people. Wait, isn't that a carb? Isn't that sweet? Yes, it is sweet, but in the best possible way. Sweet potatoes are rich in potassium and magnesium, 2 minerals that help relax the muscles, including the bladder, and regulate fluid balance in the body. They're also high in fiber, which indirectly reduces nighttime urination by preventing constipation. You see, when older adults struggle with bowel movements, pressure builds in the abdomen. That added pressure presses against the bladder, triggering the urge to urinate, even if the bladder isn't full. Sweet potato helps with all of it. Soothes digestion, balances electrolytes, gently satisfies nighttime hunger. I often tell my patients a small baked sweet potato at dinner with a little olive oil or cinnamon is not just delicious, it's therapeutic. You get stable energy, steady nerves, and a bladder that feels at ease.
In Japanese tradition, sweet potato satsumaimo is considered a food of longevity, not just because it nourishes the body, but because it creates inner calm. When served warm in the early evening, it sends a very clear message to the body: night is coming. Slow down. You are safe. I remember one gentleman, 86 years old, who used to wake up every night at 1:00, 3:00, and 5:00. He tried medications. He tried reducing fluids. Nothing worked. When we added a small bowl of steamed sweet potato to his evening meal, just that his bladder stopped interrupting his dreams, not immediately. But within 10 days, he reported something beautiful. He said, "Doctor, I dreamed again. For the first time in years." That is the power of sweet potato, not just to feed, but to quiet. It is soft, easy to chew, naturally sweet without spikes. And it fills a gap that many older adults don't speak of: the need for warmth, for softness, for reassurance. When the body feels secure, it lets go of fear, it lets go of tension, and it lets go of the need to wake up.
That's such a powerful story, Doctor. Because you're right, nighttime waking is about more than biology. It's about how safe your body feels. So, if you're listening right now and you've been struggling with broken sleep, remember this: your dinner plate is one of your greatest tools. Celery during the day, onions in the evening, and sweet potato before the sun goes down. These are not just vegetables. They are invitations for your body to rest. We've now seen the power of 3 vegetables: celery, onion, and sweet potato. But knowledge means little without action. So the question becomes, how do you turn these foods into a daily practice that actually works? That's where the Shigeaki Evening Plan comes in. It's not a meal plan. It's not a diet. It's a gentle rhythm, a way to wind down the body so that rest comes easily and waking up in the night becomes rare. Here's how it works. Start early in the day. Eat your celery at lunch or blend it into an early afternoon smoothie. This activates your kidneys gently while the sun is still high, so your body doesn't have to process excess fluid while you sleep. After 3 p.m., reduce caffeine and fluids. Switch to warm teas like barley or roasted rice tea. Avoid diuretics like coffee or green tea late in the day. Give your bladder a break before bedtime even begins. Eat your onion and sweet potato at dinner before 7 p.m., if possible. Gently sauté onions with olive oil or roast them with herbs. Add a small serving of sweet potato, steamed or baked, served warm. This calms the gut, relaxes the bladder, and nourishes without overstimulating. End your evening with stillness. After dinner, avoid screens. Take a short walk. Breathe slowly. And most importantly, don't eat again. Let the body enter sleep in peace, not digestion.
In Japan, we call this yushoku no ma, the space around the evening meal. It is not only about food, it is about slowing time. Too many elders eat dinner with television, with worry, with distraction. Then they ask, why does my body not rest? But when we return to stillness, when we eat with quiet, when we chew our food like it is a form of prayer, then the bladder begins to trust again. Then the kidneys soften. Then sleep becomes a friend, not a fight. I tell my patients, your evening begins with how you chew. Your night begins with how you sit. And your sleep begins with the love you give to your plate.
That's profound. And so different from how most of us are taught to eat. In the West, dinner is often the biggest, heaviest, loudest meal of the day. But what you're saying, Doctor, is that dinner should be the softest meal because it leads us into the most vulnerable part of life, sleep.
Yes, we are not feeding the body alone. We are feeding the nervous system. We are feeding trust.
Let's pause for a moment. Today we talked about celery, onion, and sweet potato. We talked about kidneys, bladders, minerals, and inflammation. But really, what we talked about was peace. Because when you're waking up 2, 3, 4 times every night, you're not just losing sleep. you're losing rhythm. You're losing confidence. You're losing the simple joy of lying in bed and knowing you're safe. And here's the hopeful part. You can get that peace back, not with more pills, not with more restriction, but with food, with rhythm, with respect.
Have lived over 100 years. And what I have seen again and again is that the elders who sleep well are not always the healthiest. They are the most gentle with themselves. They eat early. They eat simple. They avoid noise at night, not only around them, but inside them. One woman once told me, "Doctor, I never thought warm sweet potato could give me more sleep than any medicine." And she was right, because rest comes not from fighting the body, but from listening to it.
To every listener over 60, I want to say this. You deserve to sleep. You deserve to feel rested when you wake. And you deserve to know that your body is still capable of peace. So, tonight try it. Eat gently, drink wisely, chew slowly, and let your bladder rest so your brain can finally dream again.
And if you know someone waking up too much at night, someone tired, frustrated, maybe even ashamed, share this episode with them. Because sometimes just one idea, one vegetable, one evening can change everything.
If you found this helpful, please subscribe to the Shigeaki podcast, leave us a kind review, and pass it on to a parent, a neighbor, or a friend who's struggling. We'll be back soon with more stories, more science, and more ways to live well. Not just longer, but better.
Until then, eat with peace, rest with kindness, and sleep like someone who knows they are safe.